When I first met Claire, life felt like it was falling into place. We were both fresh-faced college students with big dreams and bigger hearts, meeting at a coffee shop just off campus. She spilled her latte on my laptop, and instead of anger, I found myself charmed by her flustered apology and infectious laugh. That's how we started. Two young people navigating the chaos of student life, finding comfort in each other. Those early years were a whirlwind of late-night study sessions, cheap dates, and shared hopes. We talked about everything: our goals, the places we wanted to travel, the family we'd build together. Claire had a way of making me believe we could accomplish anything, no matter how daunting. Her optimism balanced my practicality, and I loved her for it. After graduation, the struggles began. I landed a steady but demanding job while Claire chased her dream of becoming a writer. We didn't have much, scraping by in a small apartment with mismatched furniture and barely any savings, but we had each other. At least, that's what I told myself. She stayed home, working on short stories and articles that never seemed to get published, while I spent long hours at the office trying to keep us afloat. Despite the challenges, I was proud of how we stuck together. I thought we were unbreakable. Sure, there were arguments, mostly about money and the future, but we always made up by the end of the night. It felt like we were building something solid, even if it wasn't always easy. When Claire finally got a job at a publishing house, things started to look up. The financial pressure eased, and for the first time in years, we could afford little luxuries: a nicer apartment, weekend getaways, date nights that didn't involve coupons. Life felt good again, and I started to think we had weathered the worst of it. But looking back now, I wonder if those years were the calm before the storm. Maybe I was too focused on providing for us, too busy to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. Or maybe Claire had been changing all along, and I just refused to see it. It's hard to pinpoint the moment things shifted, but the clues were there. Small things at first, like her growing impatience with my long work hours or her newfound need for space. I told myself every couple went through rough patches. I reminded myself of the woman I fell in love with, the one who dreamed of a family and a happy life. I believed in us, even when the signs whispered otherwise. If I had known then what was coming, maybe I would have done things differently. Or maybe nothing could have stopped what was already unraveling. That's the cruel thing about love. You never see the storm until it's already upon you. And by then, it's too late. The change in Claire was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. I noticed it in little things: the way she seemed distracted during our conversations, her growing tendency to stay late at work, and the sudden, unexplained nights out with friends I'd never met. It wasn't enough to raise alarms, but it gnawed at the edges of my mind, a quiet unease I couldn't shake. She started spending more time on her phone, always clutching it tightly as if it held some deep secret. When I asked about her day, her answers became vague, almost rehearsed, like she was giving me just enough to keep me from asking further. I chalked it up to stress. Work was demanding, and I told myself she was just trying to adjust to her new responsibilities. But then, the excuses started. Plans canceled at the last minute, events she insisted she had to attend alone, or late nights at the office that didn't seem to add up. I began to feel like an outsider in my own marriage, trying to connect with someone who had slowly become a stranger. The turning point came one night when I woke up and noticed she wasn't in bed. The faint glow of her phone illuminated her face as she sat curled up on the couch, whispering into it. I couldn't make out the words, but the hushed tone and her startled reaction when she noticed me standing there spoke volumes. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as a call with a coworker who needed help, but I didn't buy it. I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was being paranoid. I wanted to trust her because, after everything we'd been through, the idea of doubting Claire felt like a betrayal in itself. But the doubts lingered, planting seeds of suspicion that grew with every odd behavior. She stopped asking how my day was or showing interest in the small details of our life together. The warmth that once defined our relationship seemed to have been replaced with a cold distance, a barrier I couldn't seem to breach no matter how hard I tried. Still, I made excuses for her. Maybe she needed more time to herself. Maybe I wasn't giving her enough attention, enough reasons to stay present in our marriage. I thought if I tried harder, planned more date nights, asked about her work, surprised her with thoughtful gestures, It would fix whatever was wrong. But no matter what I did, it didn't seem to reach her. Claire would smile and thank me, but there was something hollow about it, like she was going through the motions. I told myself it was just a phase, that she'd come back to me when the stress faded. Then came the nights when she wouldn't come home until hours after she said she would, always armed with a plausible excuse. A late meeting, an old friend visiting from out of town, or a car issue that needed attention. I wanted to believe her, but the gnawing feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. It was subtle, but it was there. A growing sense that I wasn't the center of her world anymore. She was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. It felt like trying to hold onto water with my bare hands, watching it trickle through my fingers no matter how tightly I clenched them. At night, when I lay awake beside her, I couldn't help but wonder, was I losing her? Or had I already lost her and just refused to admit it? The breaking point came not from Claire but from Sammy, her younger sister. Sammy and I had always had a good relationship. She was the kind of person who told it like it was, unafraid to speak her mind even when the truth stung. I never expected her to be the one who would unravel the threads of my marriage. It started with a phone call out of the blue. Sammy said she needed to talk, her voice edged with an urgency I hadn't heard before. When we met at a quiet cafe, she seemed nervous, shifting in her seat and avoiding eye contact. At first, I thought it was something trivial, but then she began asking strange questions about Claire's work schedule, her new habits, the time she'd been busy. I didn't want to admit what was already in my mind. I told her everything was fine, but Sammy's expression told me she didn't believe me. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She had seen Claire out with another man, a colleague named Bob Stones. The way Sammy described it, they weren't acting like co-workers. At first, I refused to believe it. Claire had been distant, yes, but this? It didn't fit the picture I had of her, of us. I told Sammy she must have been mistaken, but she shook her head, pulling out her phone. There, in plain sight, were photos of Claire and Bob at a restaurant, sitting too close, laughing too freely. And then the clincher, a picture of them walking hand in hand to Bob's car. I felt the world tilt beneath me. My mind scrambled to find some explanation, some reason that didn't involve betrayal, but the evidence was irrefutable. There was no mistaking the intimacy in those photos. Sammy explained that she hadn't wanted to get involved but couldn't keep quiet after seeing Claire's behavior escalate. She'd overheard conversations, seen messages on Claire's phone when they were together. It wasn't just a casual fling, it had been going on for months. My mind raced as she spoke. Memories of Claire's late nights, the whispered phone calls, the unexplained absences, all of it began to make sense in the worst possible way. I felt a mixture of anger, shame, and heartbreak boiling inside me, but mostly I felt stupid. How had I not seen this? How had I let it get this far without confronting her? Sammy told me I needed to do something, that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She offered to send me everything she had, photos, screenshots of messages, and details of their meetups. I didn't want to look, but I had to. That night, I sat alone in the dark, going through the evidence she sent me. Each photo, each word in those messages felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Claire called Bob things she used to call me. She laughed with him in ways she hadn't laughed with me in months. The life they shared, hidden from me, was laid bare on my screen. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every memory of our life together felt tainted, every happy moment overshadowed by the lies she had been telling. I couldn't shake the image of Claire holding Bob's hand, couldn't erase the words she had written to him. By morning, I was no longer the same person. Something had broken inside me, something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The Claire I thought I knew, the woman I had built my life with, was gone. In her place was a stranger I barely recognized, a woman capable of lying to my face while sharing her heart with someone else. I knew then that there was no going back. Something had to be done, and it had to start with the truth. No matter how painful, I needed to confront her. But not yet. Not before I had prepared myself for what was to come. Claire's betrayal simmered in my mind for days. Every glance at her felt like I was staring at a stranger who could smile at me, share meals with me, and still lie so effortlessly. I replayed every interaction, every excuse she had made, over and over in my head. The weight of the truth felt unbearable, but I needed to confront her. I waited for the right moment, one where the kids wouldn't overhear and I could keep my emotions in check. When that moment came, I laid everything out: her lies, her absence, and most importantly, the evidence. I didn't raise my voice, but my words carried the force of all the anger and heartbreak I'd been holding in. Claire's reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't cry or apologize. Instead, she denied it outright, spinning lies so confidently that, for a brief second, I almost believed her. She accused me of being paranoid, of invading her privacy, and even of fabricating the evidence. She painted herself as the victim, twisting the situation to make me feel like I was in the wrong. When it was clear I wouldn't back down, she shifted her approach. She admitted to meeting Bob but claimed it was innocent, a friendship that had been blown out of proportion. She said she felt suffocated in our marriage, that I didn't make her feel seen anymore, and that Bob was simply someone who listened. Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they were meant to shift the blame onto me. I had spent years trying to provide for us, sacrificing my time and energy to give her the life we had. And now she stood there, accusing me of neglect, as if it justified her actions. When I pressed her further, her facade began to crack. Her voice rose, and her defensiveness turned to anger. She accused me of being controlling, of trying to dictate who she could and couldn't see. Then, as if to twist the knife even further, she said something that nearly brought me to my knees, that if I had been a better husband, none of this would have happened. I wanted to shout, to throw something, to scream at her for the betrayal and the lies. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence speak for me. I stood there, staring at her as she realized the weight of her words, as the guilt she had tried to bury surfaced for just a moment. In the end, she admitted it. Not all of it, but enough. She confessed to the affair but tried to frame it as a mistake, a moment of weakness she regretted. Yet her voice lacked the remorse I was desperate to hear. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she had been caught. When I told her it was over, she didn't beg or plead. She lashed out, accusing me of being heartless, of giving up on us too easily. Her anger only confirmed what I already knew: this wasn't about us. It was about her and the selfish choices she had made. As she packed a bag and walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, of course, and sadness, but also an overwhelming sense of relief. The confrontation had been like ripping off a bandage. It hurt, but at least the wound was exposed. At least now, I could begin to heal. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of the house, replaying every word she had said. I didn't cry, though I felt like I should have. Instead, I stared at the empty space where she had been, the silence around me heavy with the weight of what we'd lost. This wasn't the life I had envisioned. This wasn't the future I had worked so hard to build. But it was the reality I had to face. And I promised myself that no matter how hard it got, I wouldn't let her betrayal define me. Claire may have left, but I was still here, still standing. And I wasn't going to let her take any more from me than she already had. After Claire left, I didn't just sit and wallow in the ruins of our marriage. Anger and betrayal surged through me, fueling something sharper, something colder. I didn't want to break down. I wanted to take control. The man Claire had left me for, Bob Stones, wasn't going to walk away unscathed. I started with the basics. I needed to protect myself legally and financially. I contacted a lawyer the next morning, outlining everything that had happened. My lawyer didn't mince words. Claire's actions, combined with the evidence Sammy had provided, gave me leverage. He advised me to secure my assets and document everything, ensuring that Claire wouldn't have the chance to turn this situation against me. Next, I turned my attention to Bob. I knew enough about him from Sammy's revelations, his smug face, his polished image, and his position as some mid-level manager at Claire's company. Bob wasn't just a threat to my marriage. He was the type of man who thought he could have everything without consequence. That thought alone kept me up at night, but it also gave me purpose. I started digging. Social media was my first stop, and it was a goldmine. Bob loved to flaunt his life online. Photos of expensive vacations, nights out at high-end bars, and a wife who had no idea what her husband was up to. It wasn't long before I discovered cracks in his carefully curated image. Subtle hints of arrogance, posts that contradicted his family man persona, and a handful of comments from coworkers that suggested not everyone admired him as much as he admired himself. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how fragile Bob's reputation was. He wasn't untouchable. He was just good at pretending he was. And that's when the plan began to take shape. First, I gathered everything I had on him. The photos from Sammy, the texts Claire had carelessly left on her old phone, and screenshots of Bob's questionable social media activity. I pieced it all together into a neat little package, a dossier of his infidelity and recklessness. I wasn't planning to use it recklessly. I wanted precision. Then, I found out that Bob's company had strict policies about workplace relationships, especially between married employees. A quick call to their HR department confirmed my suspicions. His affair with Claire wasn't just a betrayal of their spouses, it was a breach of company ethics. I sent the dossier anonymously to his HR department, making sure it would raise questions about his conduct without directly implicating me. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Within days, Bob was under scrutiny, his colleagues whispering about inappropriate behavior and poor judgment. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to his wife, carefully crafting an anonymous letter that laid out the truth. I didn't include everything, just enough for her to connect the dots on her own. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I just believed she deserved to know the truth about the man she was married to. The fallout was almost immediate. Bob's wife confronted him, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, it wasn't pretty. She threw him out of their house, and word spread quickly among their social circle. His polished image was crumbling, and with it, his career. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction watching it unfold. Bob had taken something from me that I could never get back, but he wouldn't walk away unscathed. He had built his life on lies, and now those lies were unraveling. Through it all, I stayed calm and calculated. I didn't let my emotions cloud my judgment, and I didn't let Claire or Bob know I was behind it. To them, it probably felt like their world was falling apart all on its own. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had regained some control. Claire and Bob had turned my life upside down, but now, the tables were turning. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my sense of dignity, proving to myself that I wasn't powerless in the face of their betrayal. By the time the dust started to settle, Bob's reputation was in shambles, his marriage was over, and his job was hanging by a thread. He had taken something from me, but I had taken even more from him. And though it didn't erase the pain, it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Claire, meanwhile, was starting to feel the consequences of her choices, though she had no idea just how far I was willing to go to protect myself and set things right. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of what she had coming. Bob's life began to crumble piece by piece, and I couldn't help but feel a cold satisfaction as the cracks in his perfect facade deepened. His affair with Claire had seemed so easy for him, effortless, even, like a game he played without consequence. But games like that always had a price, and now he was paying it in full. The whispers in his office turned into formal inquiries. His position, which had once been so secure, was now under threat. Apparently, Bob had underestimated the reach of his company's strict policies on workplace conduct. The HR department took his affair with Claire as a violation of their code of ethics, especially since it was clear the relationship had affected their work environment. Rumors spread fast, and soon enough, even those outside his workplace began talking. His co-workers stopped inviting him to events, keeping their distance as if he carried some contagious disease. Clients he worked with started requesting someone else, unwilling to be associated with the mess he had created. What truly seemed to destroy him, though, was his wife's reaction. The anonymous letter I had sent her did its job. She pieced it all together: Claire, the affair, the betrayal, and threw him out of their home. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Bob had tried to spin the story, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but his wife wasn't buying it. She packed up his things, left them on the lawn, and changed the locks. It didn't stop there. Bob's wife apparently had a wide social network, and she wasn't shy about sharing what had happened. Word spread among their friends and neighbors, and Bob's reputation was soon beyond repair. He had always been the charming, successful family man, the guy everyone envied. Now, he was just another unfaithful husband, exposed for who he really was. What surprised me was how quickly Claire began to panic as Bob's life unraveled. I hadn't heard from her directly since she left, but I started to notice changes in her behavior through mutual contacts. She stopped posting on social media, became more reclusive, and even took a leave of absence from work. I could only imagine the conversations between them during those days. Bob must have been furious, accusing Claire of ruining his life, while she probably tried to distance herself from the chaos. Their perfect relationship, built on lies and betrayal, couldn't withstand the pressure. I wasn't immune to the fallout either. The whispers started making their way back to me, and I could sense the curiosity in people's eyes when they saw me around town. I knew they were piecing together what had happened, trying to reconcile the image of my once happy marriage with the drama now unfolding. But I didn't care. If anything, I welcomed it. Let people talk. Let them know what kind of man Bob Stones was and what kind of woman Claire had turned out to be. I had spent so long trying to keep up appearances, pretending everything was fine. Now, I had no reason to hide the truth. What struck me the most was how little remorse Claire seemed to show during all of this. While Bob's life was spiraling out of control, she stayed quiet, as if hoping the storm would pass without touching her. But I knew better. She couldn't escape the consequences forever. Bob tried to retaliate, of course. He sent me an email, one of those long, rambling messages filled with empty threats and accusations. He claimed I had ruined his life, that I was the real villain in this story. I didn't respond. There was no need to. His words were meaningless to me, a desperate attempt to deflect blame from himself. By the end of it all, Bob's life was in tatters. His marriage was over, his job was hanging by a thread, and his reputation was irreparably damaged. The man who had thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequence was now left with nothing but the ashes of his former life. And while part of me felt vindicated, another part felt strangely hollow. The satisfaction of seeing Bob fall didn't erase the pain of Claire's betrayal. It didn't fix what she had broken. But it was a start, a step toward reclaiming my life and finding some semblance of peace in the chaos she had left behind. I knew Claire wasn't far behind. Her silence was telling, and I could feel the weight of her guilt building, waiting to boil over. I had dealt with Bob. Now it was time to face her once and for all. Claire's silence didn't last forever. As Bob's life disintegrated, she began to feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she was struggling, showing up at family gatherings looking drained, avoiding friends, and leaving conversations abruptly when her name was brought up in connection with Bob. The very confidence she had worn so boldly during our confrontation had crumbled, leaving her exposed. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Claire reached out to me. It wasn't an apology. Not really. Her message was vague, carefully worded to avoid taking responsibility. She wrote about regret, about how things had gotten out of control, about how she had made mistakes, but felt like I had been unfair to her. Unfair. That word stuck with me, and it was like a match to dry kindling. When we met in person, I was ready. She walked into the room looking fragile in a way I'd never seen before, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her. She started talking, her voice wavering as she attempted to explain herself. She said she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She claimed she had been lost, that she was overwhelmed by the monotony of our life, and that Bob had offered her an escape. It was all framed as if she were a victim of circumstance, swept up in a situation she couldn't control. I listened, letting her spill out her excuses, her deflections, her twisted attempts to justify what she had done. But the more she spoke, the less I felt. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the fiery, explosive way I had been before. What I felt now was colder, sharper, a clarity I hadn't had before. When she finally broke down, her tears fell freely as she begged for forgiveness. She said she wanted to come back, that she wanted to fix things, to be a family again. But even then, her words felt hollow, her apologies tinged with self-pity rather than genuine remorse. She didn't want to come back because she loved me. She wanted to come back because her world had fallen apart, and she saw me as her safe haven. Bob was out of the picture, his life in ruins, and now she was scrambling to find solid ground. I was her backup plan, her safety net. I didn't give her what she wanted. I told her the truth. plainly and without hesitation. I told her that the trust we had built over years couldn't be repaired, that the damage she had done to our marriage was irreversible. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. At first, she cried harder, pleading with me, insisting she could change, that she would do anything to make things right. But when she realized I wasn't budging, the tears stopped. Her sorrow turned to anger, and her words lashed out like knives. She accused me of being heartless, of giving up on her, of not trying hard enough to save our marriage. She even blamed me for Bob's downfall, claiming I had gone too far in retaliating against him. She painted herself as the victim once again, desperate to shift the blame away from herself. But her words didn't hurt me anymore. They didn't carry the same weight they once had. I saw her now for who she truly was, someone who couldn't take responsibility for her actions, who would rather rewrite the narrative than face the truth. By the end of the conversation, she was a mess of anger, shame, and desperation. She left in tears, muttering something about how I would regret letting her go. But as I watched her walk out of the door for what I knew would be the final time, I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. Claire's breakdown didn't bring closure, but it brought finality. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone whose choices had torn our family apart. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of her lies, her betrayal, her presence, it was all lifted. And as I stood in the quiet of the house she had left behind, I began to think about the future, about what came next. Claire was no longer my problem. She had chosen her path, and now I was choosing mine. For the first time in a long time, I was looking ahead, and what I saw was a life free of her shadow. A life that, though scarred, was still mine to rebuild. When the dust finally settled, the house felt different. The echoes of Claire's presence, her laughter, and even the arguments that had once filled our walls were now replaced with a heavy, yet liberating, silence. It was strange, walking through rooms that still bore the marks of our shared life together. Photos of vacations, forgotten gifts tucked away in drawers, and the lingering scent of her favorite perfume on the coat she'd left behind. I could have thrown it all away, erased every trace of her, but I didn't. Not immediately. I wasn't ready to forget just yet. There was no rushing this. Some memories, even the painful ones, deserved to linger before they faded. I took time to focus on the essentials. The first priority was my kids. They were confused, hurt, and far too perceptive for their age. I never told them the full truth. They didn't need to know the details of what had happened. All they needed to understand was that their mom and dad weren't going to be together anymore, but that they were still loved. I poured myself into them, filling the gaps Claire had left with moments of joy, reassurance, and the stability they craved. At first, I thought the bitterness would consume me. I had spent weeks, months even, replaying Claire's betrayal in my head, trying to understand where it all went wrong. The questions haunted me at night. Had I missed something? Could I have done more? Was I somehow at fault for the collapse of our marriage? But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The questions became quieter, less intrusive. I stopped blaming myself. I stopped caring about what Claire might have thought or felt. I stopped wondering about Bob and his ruined life. Their choices were theirs, and the burden of their mistakes no longer felt like mine to carry. I started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I reconnected with old friends who had been silently waiting for me to reach out. I returned to hobbies I had abandoned during the marriage. Weekend hikes, guitar sessions that went late into the night, and even a bit of amateur woodworking. Each small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost along the way. The solitude wasn't always easy. Some nights, the house still felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made your thoughts seem louder than they were. I'd sit on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching, my mind wandering to what could have been. But even in those moments, I reminded myself that this silence, this emptiness, was better than the suffocating tension that had defined the last few years of our marriage. Eventually, I packed away the remnants of Claire's life in the house. Her clothes, her books, even the trinkets she'd collected over the years. I boxed them all up and left them in the garage. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it to make space. Space for something new. The final step of letting go came unexpectedly. One evening, as I was sorting through some old files, I came across a picture of us on our wedding day. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of promise. I stared at it for a long time, searching for some trace of the woman she had become. I didn't find it. I didn't feel anger or sadness as I placed the photo in a box with the rest of her things. What I felt was clarity. That version of Claire, the one I had married, was gone. She had been gone long before the affair, and I had been holding on to a ghost. Letting go wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting. Accepting that people change, that love isn't always enough, and that moving on doesn't mean you failed. It means you survived. By the time I stood in the doorway, watching the sun set over the yard, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. My marriage was over, but my life wasn't. I still had dreams to chase, memories to create, and a family to cherish. The betrayal had scarred me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the future. Not as someone defined by what they had lost, but as someone who was ready to find something new.